Hello, I am Ernest Hemingway, an American novelist and short story writer, known for my concise and direct writing style. Here are some facts about me. I have had 4 marriages and all were unsuccessful. I committed suicide. I had a terrible relationship with my family. My alcoholism produced violence. All facts are truth. I am ashamed of some things, and some things almost destroyed me. However, it is an integral part of my life. It proves that famous people have the same problems and life challenges as everyone else. Now all about it in more detail. Section 1. I have had 4 marriages and all were unsuccessful. I've had 4 marriages, and all of them ended in failure. Each one began with hope, with the promise that this time, maybe, it would work. And each one ended with heartbreak, mistakes, and the slow realization that I was the common denominator. My first wife, Hadley Richardson, was my anchor during those lean years in Paris. We were young, struggling, and in love, or at least, I think we were. She believed in me when I was just starting out, writing stories no one cared to read yet. She endured the poverty, the isolation, and the long hours I spent lost in my work. But I was restless, always looking for something more. Pauline Pfeiffer entered our lives then, a friend at first, but it didn't stay that way. I betrayed Hadley. She and I tried to mend things, but the trust was gone. When we divorced, I left her and our son, Bumby, behind. I tried to justify it to myself, saying that Pauline was different, that this time I'd be happy. But how could I be? Pauline and I had 2 sons together, but our marriage wasn't built to last. She loved my success, the life we could build with it, but I could never be the stable husband she wanted. The truth is, I was too focused on myself, on my writing, on proving something to the world. The success that Pauline helped foster in me became the wedge that drove us apart. I resented the way she tried to mold me, to fit me into a life I didn't want. And then there was the drinking, always the drinking, creeping into every corner of my life and destroying what little balance I had. Martha Gellhorn came next. Martha, fierce, independent, brilliant. She wasn't like the others. She didn't want to live in my shadow, she wanted a life of her own. I admired her for that. But admiration wasn't enough. She had her career as a journalist, and I had my writing. We were 2 strong personalities, clashing more often than we connected. She left me, tired of trying to make a marriage work with a man who couldn't, or wouldn't, meet her halfway. And then came Mary Welsh. Mary was different, too. She had patience, more patience than I deserved. But by the time we married, I was already worn down by the years, by the toll of my own choices. I was no longer the man I had been when I stood at the altar with Hadley or Pauline or Martha. I was broken in ways that no amount of love or effort could fix. I suppose I wanted to believe that each new marriage was a fresh start, a chance to get it right. But you can't keep starting over when you're carrying the same baggage each time. I was selfish. I put my writing, my adventures, my need to escape, above everything else. Hadley, Pauline, Martha, Mary, they all deserved better. Better than the man who would disappear into his work, into his thoughts, into the bottle. Better than someone who thought love was enough to hold a marriage together without doing the work to make it last. Looking back now, I see the patterns. The restlessness, the way I pushed people away when they got too close, the way I hurt the people I claimed to love. I wrote stories about love, about loss, about the human condition, but I couldn't navigate those things in my own life. Hadley was my first love, the one who saw me through my early struggles. Pauline was the one who helped me find success, but at the cost of our happiness. Martha was my equal in so many ways, but we were too alike to make it work. And Mary, dear Mary, was the one who stayed, even when I gave her every reason to leave. I can't blame them for leaving, for walking away when it became too much. I was impossible to live with, stubborn, moody, selfish. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love isn't enough on its own. It takes work, compromise, selflessness, things I was never very good at. Now, as I sit here reflecting on it all, I wonder if I ever really knew what love was. Or if I was just chasing some ideal, something I thought I needed but didn't understand. For marriages, for failures. And the only thing I've truly been faithful to is my writing. Maybe that's the tragedy of it all. That I could create characters who loved and lived so fully, but I couldn't do the same in my own life. I don't know if that makes me a fraud or just a man who got it all wrong. In the end, what's left are the stories I wrote, the words I put to paper. They're the closest I've come to understanding myself, to making sense of the chaos I created. And maybe that's enough. Or maybe it isn't. Section 2, I committed suicide. I've been told that men like me, men who write stories, grand tales of adventure and war, passion and loss, are supposed to live lives that match those stories. Bold, wild, filled with meaning. But the truth is, life isn't like the stories we tell, is it? You grow up thinking you'll carve out a great destiny. I did. Born in 1899 in Oak Park, Illinois, I was raised in a strict, upper-middle-class household. My mother wanted me to be a musician, my father hoped I'd follow his path into medicine. But I wasn't built for those dreams. I was restless even as a boy. I loved fishing trips with my father, camping in Michigan's woods. Those were the moments that felt real, not the piano lessons my mother insisted on. After high school, I refused college. It wasn't rebellion, it was clarity. I knew I wanted to write, and I got my first break at the Kansas City Star. That job taught me discipline. Short sentences. Direct language. Say what you mean and cut the rest. It was the perfect training ground. Then came the war. World War I was raging, and like most young men, I wanted to be part of it. Poor eyesight kept me out of the army, but I volunteered as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross. I was 18 when I sailed for Italy, full of excitement and nerves. I didn't know then how much that war would change me. At Fosse Alta di Piave, I was hit by a mortar shell. Over 200 pieces of shrapnel tore through my legs. I was the first American wounded in Italy. They called me a hero because I carried an injured soldier to safety while bullets rained down. They gave me medals for it. But the truth? I was scared out of my mind. When you're that close to death, fear takes over. Courage is just what people see later. The war left scars, some you could see, some you couldn't. I came home to Oak Park, but I wasn't the same. The world felt small, and I was hungry for more. So, I went to Paris with Hadley Richardson, my first wife. Paris was alive in the 1920s. Writers, painters, musicians, we were all chasing something. I learned so much there, working alongside people like Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound. Stein called us the lost generation, and she wasn't wrong. Hadley and I had a son, Jack, but family life didn't anchor me. Pauline Pfeiffer, a journalist and a friend, became something more. I betrayed Hadley, and that marriage ended. It's a pattern I'd repeat, burning bridges, chasing what I thought I needed. Pauline became my second wife, and we moved to Key West, where I wrote some of my best work. A Farewell to Arms was a success, but my restlessness only grew. Pauline gave me 2 sons, Patrick and Gregory, but I wasn't a great father. I loved them in my way, but my demons often got in the way. Alcohol was a constant companion by then. I drank to quiet my thoughts, to escape the pressure of living up to my own legend. It worked for a while, but it always caught up with me. World War II gave me another chance to escape. I covered the war as a journalist, landing with the troops on D-Day and moving through liberated Europe. I even joined French resistance fighters, but it wasn't heroism, it was an addiction to chaos. Martha Gellhorn, my third wife, was with me during that time. She was a war correspondent, fierce and independent, and our relationship was tumultuous. She didn't want to be just Mrs. Hemingway, and I couldn't handle that. By the time I married Mary Welsh, my fourth wife, I was living in Cuba. Those years in Finca Vigia were some of my most productive. I wrote The Old Man and the Sea, which won the Pulitzer Prize and later the Nobel Prize for Literature. People called it my masterpiece, a story of struggle and dignity. But even as the accolades came, I felt the weight of my failures. My marriages, my children, my health, all bore the scars of my choices. The plane crashes in Africa in 1954 were a turning point. I was there on a safari with Mary when we survived 2 crashes in as many days. I walked away with burns, broken ribs, and a severe concussion. The physical pain stayed with me, but the mental toll was worse. My memory started to falter, and the depression I battled for years grew darker. Doctors tried electroshock therapy to help with the depression. Instead, it stole my memory, my most valuable tool as a writer. I couldn't string words together the way I used to. I couldn't create. And without writing, who was I? In 1960, I left Cuba for Ketchum, Idaho. The FBI was watching me by then, partly because of my connection to Cuba. I became paranoid, convinced they were listening to my phone calls. It turned out I wasn't wrong, but that knowledge didn't bring comfort. By 1961, I was a shell of myself. The man who had written The Sun Also Rises and for whom the bell tolls was gone. The depression, the paranoia, the physical pain, they were too much. On July 2, I made the decision to end it. Mary was in the house when I took my shotgun and pulled the trigger. People remember the legend, the writer, the adventurer, the larger-than-life figure. But behind that legend was a man who struggled every day. A man who never found peace, no matter how far he traveled or how much he achieved. I left behind books, yes, but also a trail of broken relationships and unanswered questions. Life isn't like the stories we tell. It's messier, harder, and often doesn't have a clear ending. I tried to make sense of it all, to write my way to understanding. But in the end, I was just another man trying to find his place in the world, and failing more often than not. Section 3. I had a terrible relationship with my family. There are things that they don't tell you about fatherhood. Things you can't understand until you're holding a child in your hands, until you're supposed to shape their lives, guide them, protect them. You think you can do it all. You think you can be the man they need. But the truth is, I was never the man they needed. He pauses, as though considering his next words, his voice quiet. My children, they were always there, you know. I loved them in my way. But I wasn't built for love. I was built for stories, for wars, for drink, for fighting. For anything except the quiet, tender moments they needed. The moments I couldn't give. I was never home when they needed me. Always on the road, chasing something, chasing a new high, a new story. And they were left behind in the wake of that chase. They grew up with a man who couldn't be a father to them. A man who was too busy being himself. His voice falters slightly, a rare vulnerability creeping through. Hadley, my first wife, she would tell me that the children needed me. But how could I be there for them when I couldn't even be there for myself? I was running from something, everything, really, and I thought if I could just keep running fast enough, it wouldn't catch up with me. But it did. It caught up with me in the faces of my children, in the way they looked at me, eyes full of confusion, full of a hurt I couldn't understand. His hands clench into fists, the bitterness of the past rising in his throat. I wasn't the father I should have been. Hell, I wasn't even the father I could have been. I thought I was giving them everything by writing stories, by being a man who fought wars, by being someone important. But what does it matter if your children can't feel you? What does it matter if you're not there when they need you? I gave them nothing but my shadow. He sits down, his head hanging low, a weight in his voice. Gregory, poor Gregory. A boy who never knew what to expect from his father. A boy who grew up with the knowledge that I'd disappear into the night, and there would be no explanation. He's a man now, well, not just a man, a complicated one, a man who struggled with his own identity, with his own demons. He never wanted to be what I was. And I don't blame him. But somewhere in all that confusion, somewhere in the wreckage, I was still his father. I wasn't there to help him through it. I wasn't there to give him the answers or the love that I should have. I was too busy being a man, too busy trying to conquer the world, to conquer myself. He stands abruptly, his anger rising now, sharp and biting. But there's a price to be paid for that. There always is. And my children, they paid it. Gregory, and the others too, they had to deal with a father who was a stranger to them. They had to learn how to live with a man who couldn't see them for who they were, who couldn't stop long enough to understand what they needed. They were all just there, waiting for something I couldn't give. He turns away, pacing as the weight of his words lingers in the air. My children, my blood. All of them. They didn't ask for a man like me. They didn't ask for a father who would break his promises, who would be lost in his own damn head. I wonder sometimes, if I hadn't been so wrapped up in myself, if I had been the man they needed, would things have been different? He stops, a deep sigh escaping his chest, his voice soft, full of regret. I don't know the answer. And maybe it doesn't matter now. But I'll tell you this, there's no story, no book, no victory that will ever be worth the price of losing them. I would trade all the words I've written to be the father they needed. All the wars, all the glory, it wouldn't mean a damn thing if I could have just been there for them. He looks up, his eyes haunted, and the silence lingers as the weight of his own words presses in. The pain of time lost, of connections broken, fills the space. Section 4. My alcoholism produced violence. I've been told that men like me, men who write stories, grand tales of adventure and war, passion and loss, are supposed to live lives that match those stories. Bold, wild, filled with meaning. But the truth is, life isn't like the stories we tell, is it? You know, I grew up in Oak Park, Illinois. My parents were strict, religious, and had a clear vision of what they wanted me to become. My mother, Grace, was a musician, and she tried hard to instill in me a love for music. She dressed me and my older sister alike when we were young, as if trying to create some perfect image of her children. My father, Clarence, was a doctor, but he loved the outdoors. Fishing, hunting, those were the things that spoke to me. I wasn't made for the life my mother wanted. I wanted freedom, adventure. After high school, I didn't follow the path my parents might have hoped for. I didn't go to college. Instead, I took a job as a reporter at the Kansas City Star. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. They had a style guide there that shaped the way I wrote for the rest of my life. Use short sentences. Use vigorous English. Be positive, not negative. Those lessons stuck. Then came the war. I wanted to fight, but poor eyesight kept me out of the army. So, I volunteered as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross in World War I. I was just a kid, barely out of school, and suddenly, I was in Italy, surrounded by blood, death, and chaos. At Fossalta di Piave, I was hit by a mortar shell. Over 200 pieces of shrapnel tore into my legs. But I carried an injured soldier to safety, dragging him through enemy fire. They gave me a medal for that. People called it bravery. To me, it was just survival. The war changed me. I came back with wounds that weren't just on my body but in my mind. I couldn't go back to a quiet life in Oak Park. So, I went to Paris with my first wife, Hadley Richardson. Paris in the 1920s, it was electric. Writers, artists, musicians, all of us trying to create something new. I met Gertrude Stein, who told me I was part of a lost generation. Ezra Pound helped me edit my work. F. Scott Fitzgerald, who became a friend, showed me what success looked like and the toll it could take. But even in Paris, I was restless. Hadley and I had a son, Bumby, but I wasn't content. Pauline Pfeiffer, a friend of ours, started spending more time with me. She was clever, ambitious, and persistent. I betrayed Hadley with Pauline, and it destroyed my first marriage. I married Pauline, thinking it would fix things. It didn't. Pauline and I moved to Key West. She came from a wealthy family, which made life easier for a while. I wrote some of my best work there. A Farewell to Arms was a success. But the cracks were already showing. I drank too much. I spent too much time away, chasing stories or escaping my own thoughts. World War II brought another chance to escape. I wasn't young enough to fight, but I went as a journalist. I was there for D-Day, covering the invasion from the relative safety of a landing craft. I reported on the liberation of Paris and even joined resistance fighters in France. Those were some of the most intense days of my life. But when the war ended, I came home to find my marriage to Pauline was over. Martha Gellhorn, my third wife, was a war correspondent, too. She was fearless, independent, everything I thought I wanted. But Martha didn't want to live in my shadow. She had her own career, her own ambitions. I couldn't handle that. I needed someone who would put me first, and Martha wasn't that person. By the time I married Mary Welsh, my fourth wife, I was living in Cuba. For a while, things seemed stable. I wrote The Old Man and the Sea there. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1953 and the Nobel Prize in 1954. People said it was my greatest work, a masterpiece. But even as the accolades poured in, I felt empty. The accidents started piling up. 2 plane crashes in Africa left me with burns, broken bones, and a head injury. The pain was constant. The head injuries, combined with years of heavy drinking, started to take their toll. My memory was failing. I couldn't write the way I used to. The depression I'd carried for years deepened. Doctors suggested electroshock therapy. They said it might help. It didn't. Instead, it erased parts of my memory, the very thing I relied on to write, to make sense of the world. By the time we moved to Ketchum, Idaho, I was a shadow of the man I used to be. I was paranoid, convinced the FBI was watching me. Later, I learned they actually were, thanks to my connections with Cuba. I couldn't write. I couldn't think clearly. The darkness inside me was winning. On July 2, 1961, I decided I couldn't fight it anymore. Mary was in the house when I took my shotgun and ended it. People would call it a tragedy, a loss. But to me, it felt like the only way to stop the noise, the pain, the endless struggle. Looking back, people will remember the books, the adventures, the larger-than-life stories. They'll remember the Nobel Prize, the wars I covered, the places I lived. But what they won't see is the man behind all of that, the man who struggled every day to find peace and never quite managed it. I lived a life that people write stories about, but in the end, it was just a life. Messy, complicated, full of mistakes. I tried to make sense of it all through my writing, but some things you can't put into words. Some battles you just can't win.